start, we've done some research recently. We've looked across sort of the last 12 months worth of data for our clients, haven't we? And we've sort of tried to identify what are some of the things that our clients are grappling with, but from a bigger group of, a bigger sample, I guess, of data than what we do typically with a client one-on-one.
Yeah.
One of the things that you mentioned to me the other day, which we've pulled out of the research, is this concept of intent and action, that people are inherently programmed to want to do the right thing, but sometimes don't act on that, or there's something holding them back from acting on that want to do a good thing. What's your sort of idea of the concept of that action and intent gap?
Well, it's an oddly controversial concept, actually, particularly in this day and age. And you'd say we've been doing the research, we've had a look at this 12 months worth of data, but it's actually given me the chance to reflect on the last decade and what's changed. And of course, societally, particularly in the UK, a huge amount has changed from Brexit 10 years ago through pandemic and everything else. And so looking at the research, I think we wanted to understand what's happening now, because of course all those things have a big impact on individual attitudes, values and beliefs, and that comes into an organisational context. And so when you're talking about how you make a difference in organisations and move things on, you can't ignore that context. And so I think I like to challenge us to think, how much are we understanding that concept in the work that we do? Are we bearing that in mind? Is it making a difference to what we do and how we work with clients? And one of the interesting things we've always grappled with is this question around intent. In the very early days, I've been doing this for over 2 decades now, a lot of the conversations that we were having were all about intent. The whole classic, the problem with this organisation is people just don't get it. They don't get the importance
specifically
of
leaders.
Well, specifically leaders.
Yeah.
I mean, but then even peer groups.
Yeah.
We're talking about colleagues and saying, well, that group over there, they're just doing this, and so essentially people are making judgments on intent from what they're seeing, and so you get into this space of, is the problem here that we need to motivate people more, sell the hell out of health, safety and well-being, and therefore the core assumption is that inherently people wouldn't if you didn't sell the hell out of it, or are there some structural barriers stopping people? And making this challenge even more interesting, I think there's been a societal belief that when it comes down to it, at the crunch point where you want people to step in and help out, they don't. And all of that has its history in the psychology, and people listening to this will probably know about Kitty Genovese and the bystander apathy thing. And very simply, this was a situation back in the 1960s. Kitty Genovese, a woman that lived in New York, she happened to be murdered. Not unusual given the era, but what was unusual was the newspaper reports at the time. They worked out that in the investigation they'd found that 38 individual people, so 38 potential witnesses, could have stepped in and stopped this happening, and they didn't, and she got killed. So it created this kind of moral crisis. Of course, psychologists were fascinated. Does this inherently mean that even though we think of ourselves as good people in the moment, we're not? And the psychology kind of went from there. And there's so many, when you read back, there's so many studies and examples where people have said, actually, in the moment, we think there is an apathy to stepping in and helping out. What's interesting, and we reflect on our research, there's been a lot of other people doing research clearly to try and work out whether that's still the case, and I think the tide's turned. I think people recognise much more nowadays that that's not true, which is fantastic, because it's a great statement about humanity, and the bigger problem are the structural blockers to supporting that. And we can see that because there have been lots of examples where people step in, and more often than not step in and make that stand. I mean, the latest example was the stabbings in the UK, the train stabbings, where you had individuals stepping up trying to make a difference. So it's really changing our perception of what the core challenge is, and I think organisations have caught up with that. you know, I'm not ever really having the conversation with senior leaders about the importance of health, safety and well-being. They get it. They have to
and they
get
say
it.
they care about it as well,
They say
don't
they care about it, and they have to. I mean, the
Yeah.
pandemic changed the game. You can't run a big organisation nowadays without at least showing that the intent's there. Generations have changed. There's a generational expectation that they're going to be looked after, so you won't retain people. So from an organisational perspective, that's caught up. And I do firmly believe there was always the individual intent. That The only problem 10 years ago was that individual intent didn't necessarily match the organisational intent. So it's not that intent's not still a challenge. There are some people that probably need a bit of injection of this is important. However, I think the much stronger challenge now is how do we get out of people's way? How do we enable them? How do we support them?
And how do you create time?
Yeah.
Because what was really interesting in the research was that if you look at the people that want to take action, it's roughly 30 to 40% of people have that strong desire and intent to do something about it. They really care about it because of lived experience or whatever else. But there's always something. Sometimes it's perhaps bystander, but maybe it's also the complexity of work itself. So if you think about senior leaders and managers within a business, how many different types of communications on how many different platforms they get inundated with every day.
Yeah.
So it creates that time balance issue of like, well, what am I going to prioritise? Is it financial performance? Because if we don't perform financially, we're not going to have a business to be able to run and employ people and look after them. Or is it, we've had a serious incident and now actually it is on my radar because at this moment in time I need to go into a react mode rather than think proactively about preventing it in the first place, perhaps.
Completely. And the urgency does drive it, doesn't it? You know, if you believe the intent's always there, but individuals are dealing with so many other issues, as you say. I mean, the landscape for a leader has got so much more complex. Then the urgency thing is the bit that's always going to cut through, which is where I guess we try and default to create a burning platform.
Yeah.
But I do think we need to be clear that that burning platform isn't necessarily talking to core intent. It's really an exercise in reprioritisation. You need to deal with this priority right now, and that's urging people into action. And it's why it's a little bit of a blunt instrument when you think about it, because you're reprioritising in the moment, but you're not necessarily creating a sustainable structure for the delivery of those actions. And so when you hear people say, we tried this 3 years ago, what you did is you reprioritised the organisation in the moment, and therefore you created an injection of activity, but you didn't create really any extra intent because the intent was always there. And what you missed is you missed the structure of support that you needed to create, pulling the barriers down so this becomes a sustainable part of daily life. And again, if you thought about that as an exercise in injecting intent, then it is confusing because you're like, well, we've sold this, people believe in it. Well, do they believe any more, or do they just see it as more important in the moment? And I think that's an important question to answer.
It is, and I guess it also depends on what are the other perhaps psychological barriers behind the reason that person didn't take action. You know, is it the fact that there's a little bit of bias between I'm going to look after my team that then also drives siloed working? There's a whole other range of challenges that drives, or is it I just can't prioritise. I've got too many different priorities. They're all important. They're all urgent. They're all high impact. I'm going to deal with perhaps the one that I feel the most comfortable dealing with, which might not be safety. And I think what was interesting in the research, it just shows that understanding those psychological barriers is effectively the key to what a safety or a wellbeing manager or a D&I manager, because this is cross-topic, the stuff that we're talking about here. Understanding those barriers is the key responsibility of that individual and how they message, how they try and change the psychological risk barrier into a positive to enable action, I guess.
Yeah, completely. And if you go back, and people have done, because that Kitty Genovese thing was so foundational, fundamental to our understanding, and start to understand what was really, or reflect on, understand what really happened at the time, then suddenly it presents a different picture. You know, there were 38 witnesses. Actually, a whole load of them rang up the police in the background, and so it was just a misrepresentation of the investigation. It was, I believe it was Hell's Kitchen, I might be wrong, but a very dangerous part of New York.
Yeah.
How many people are really going to be prepared to speak up? The murder actually happened round the corner where nobody could see, so they said it was 38 witnesses. Actually, there were 0 witnesses. There was a sound amongst a whole bunch of other sounds that would have been happening at the time, and people had their own priorities. And you just start to look at it, you know, it's been construed or misconstrued as a failure of almost morals at the time, but actually there's so many structural barriers, and it isn't an excuse. That's the reality of it, that stop people acting out. But it is so easy for people to judge intent from action, and so hard to kind of stand back and say, actually, let me not do that. Let me try and step inside somebody else's shoes, live in their world, demonstrate empathy, and then start to work with them on what those barriers are.
Right.
And if somebody's not naturally like you, there's some obvious barriers, it makes it even harder. You know, I'm a member of the workforce, they're a leader. I'm a middle manager, they're a senior leader. I'm automatically not the same kind of person. Very hard for me to get in their world. It's very easy for me to get in the world of my team with people like me, and therefore you can see the urgency of some of their issues. But other people's teams, people wearing different badges, different coloured hats, and off you go. It's very easy for you then to just judge and say, well, I've seen them do that, therefore they don't care.
So I guess the thoughts that we've been having in summary are this sort of 3 elements. You've got intent, barriers, whether they be structural, psychological barriers, and then the action that follows through. The key message is really trying to understand what are the barriers, which are the psychological drivers driving that decision, for practitioners to then go and do some work around to help try and break down those barriers, to increase the action and therefore the sustainable change that people are looking for.
Yeah, completely. And again, the caveat, and there's always a caveat to this stuff, is we're not ignoring intent, and we're not saying it's not important, and we're not saying that an injection of inspiration and enthusiasm doesn't have benefits. But what we're trying to do, and one of the core parts of our mission, is making a difference long term. How do you make it stick? And so the bigger challenge, as we've said, is that bit of stickiness. You know, it's beyond just that injection of enthusiasm. To let's create a real difference to get us to that tipping point beyond.
Nice. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.